You and your kid are just leeches, my mother screamed in my face, and the words slammed into me harder than any physical blow could have. Her voice cut through the chatter of the family gathering, silencing forks, spoons, and laughter in a single brutal instant. For a second, I thought I had misheard, that my mind had twisted her words into something crueler than she intended. But the cold fury in her eyes left no room for doubt. I stood frozen in the living room of the house where I had grown up, clutching a small wrapped present I had brought for her birthday. My fingers trembling against the cheap paper, my son Ethan beside me, blinking in confusion, as though he had just been hit with invisible fists. My mother, Linda Walker, was 65, gray-haired but sharp-eyed, and in that moment she looked less like a tired widow and more like an executioner, ready to strip me bare in front of everyone. My brother Michael sat comfortably on the couch with his wife Vanessa at his side, the smug smirk tugging at her lips, betraying her delight in my humiliation. Not one of them came to my defense. Ethan tugged at my sleeve, whispering, "Mom," his voice cracking, but I could not answer because my throat felt like it was closing. The sting of my mother's words pierced deeper than I could have imagined. I had expected coldness. I had braced myself for her usual passive-aggressive remarks, but to call me and my child parasites in front of our entire family was beyond cruelty. It was annihilation. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, relatives who suddenly shifted uncomfortably in their seats, too cowardly to intervene, too fascinated to look away. The heat rose to my cheeks until they burned, shame flooding me, yet beneath the shame a fire began to stir. I wanted to scream, to throw the present at her feet, to demand how she could spit venom at her own daughter and grandson, but I stayed rooted in place, the shock chaining me down. In that instant, I understood something that made my stomach twist. The hostility had been waiting building, and now she had chosen to unleash it like a weapon. This was not an accident, not a slip of the tongue. It was a declaration of war. The silence that followed my mother's outburst was heavier than any silence I had ever endured, the kind that makes your ears ring and your chest ache, as if the air itself has turned against you. I could feel the burn of everyone's eyes drilling into me, cousins shifting uncomfortably, an uncle coughing into his hand to disguise his discomfort. But not one of them spoke up to defend me. My brother Michael leaned back on the sofa like a king surveying his domain, his arm draped lazily around Vanessa, who was trying and failing to hide the triumphant curve of her lips. She thrived on my humiliation. It radiated from her in waves, and when she caught me looking, she raised her eyebrows with a smirk that said, "See, you don't belong here." Ethan's hand clutched tighter at mine, his small fingers damp with sweat, his wide eyes searching my face for reassurance. But what could I possibly say? That his grandmother, the woman I had begged him to respect, had just branded us parasites. My throat was locked, my pulse a hammer against my ribs. My mother didn't stop at her first strike either. She leaned forward, voice sharp with venom, and added, "You think you can just walk in here like you belong, bringing your cheap gifts, acting like you've contributed something to this family. You've taken enough already, Rachel. You and that boy of yours are nothing but dead weight." Gasps rippled around the room, a cousin whispering, "Oh my God," under her breath. But still no one intervened. The wrapped present in my hand suddenly felt like a lump of coal, ridiculous and pathetic. I had spent my last free evening wrapping it neatly, choosing a sweater I thought she might like. But in that moment, it was nothing but evidence of my foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. Ethan's lip trembled. His eyes filled with tears. He tried so hard to blink away, and seeing his pain ignited something primal in me. My humiliation was one thing, but hers was cruelty to a child. I opened my mouth, ready to unleash the anger boiling inside, but Michael's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Mom's right," he said casually, swirling the ice in his glass of whiskey. "You can't keep living off everyone else forever, Rachel. Maybe it's time you grew up and stopped depending on this family." The words were gasoline on the fire. Vanessa chimed in, her tone syrupy sweet, but her words barbed. "Don't take it personally, Rachel, but everyone's been talking. You come here with your sob stories, always needing help, and frankly, it's exhausting. Maybe your mom's just saying what we've all been thinking." My chest tightened so hard I thought I might collapse. I wanted to scream that I had never once depended on them, that I had worked double shifts for years, that I had sacrificed everything to keep a roof over my son's head. But as I opened my mouth, my mother slammed her hand on the table, silencing me once again. Don't start with your excuses. We all know the truth. Michael has carried this family, Vanessa has supported him, and what have you done? Nothing but take, take, take. Your father would be ashamed of you. The mention of my father hit like a dagger. He had been my only ally once, the one who encouraged me when I was struggling, the one who told me I was strong. To hear his memory twisted into another weapon against me shattered something deep inside. I looked around the room desperate for even one sympathetic face, but found only averted eyes and awkward shuffles. The humiliation was complete. I was an outcast in my own bloodline. Ethan whispered, "Mom, can we go home?" His voice breaking. That was the final blow. A hot tear slid down my cheek, but I lifted my chin, forcing a brittle smile. "Of course, sweetheart," I said softly, though the words felt like glass in my throat. My mother scoffed, her lips curling. "Yes, take him. Spare us the spectacle. This is a family celebration, not a pity parade." The cruelty of her dismissal sliced deeper than any insult yet. With every eye on us, I turned slowly toward the door, clutching Ethan's hand like a lifeline. My heart pounded rage and sorrow, twisting together into a storm I could barely contain. But beneath it all, a seed of something else had been planted, a dangerous seed of resolve. They thought they had crushed me tonight. They thought they had silenced me. They were wrong. As I drove home that night with Ethan silent in the back seat, his small face pressed against the window to hide his tears, my own mind slipped backwards through the years like a film reel I could not pause. Every insult my mother had thrown at me echoed against the memories of everything I had endured and everything I had given, and the contrast made my stomach churn. I was 38 now, but it felt like I had lived 3 lifetimes already. When Ethan was born 12 years ago, my marriage had already been crumbling. His father, Jason, had promised stability, promised partnership, but those promises dissolved into smoke when the reality of responsibility arrived. By the time Ethan turned 2, I was standing in front of a judge with divorce papers in one hand and a diaper bag in the other, terrified but determined. I had walked out of that courthouse with nothing but custody of my son and the quiet conviction that I would rather struggle alone than beg a man who had abandoned us. And so I struggled. Nights spent on my feet at the hospital, the harsh fluorescent lights burning into my eyes as I stitched wounds, checked vitals, and held the hands of strangers, while silently praying my own child would stay asleep at the neighbors until I returned. Double shifts blurred into weeks, weeks into years, and every dollar I earned went toward rent, food, and school fees. My hands were often cracked from endless washing, my back ached, and sometimes exhaustion pressed down on me so hard I thought I might never stand again. But I always stood because Ethan needed me to. During those years, I still answered my mother's phone calls, still drove across town when she said she needed groceries or money for prescriptions. I still tried to be the daughter who cared, the daughter she could rely on. When her medical bills spiked after a fall, I sold the last pieces of jewelry Jason had left behind just to cover the costs. I never mentioned it, never asked for thanks, because I believed that someday she would see me for who I was. Not a leech, not a burden, but a fighter keeping my small family afloat against impossible odds. My father, George, before he died, had been the one who noticed. I could still hear his voice warm and steady, telling me, "Rachel, you've got more grit than anyone I know. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. This house will always be your home no matter what." He had said that on the porch of the very same house where tonight my mother had cast me out. He had squeezed my shoulder with a strength that seemed unbreakable, and I had believed him. But after he passed, the balance shifted. My mother grew sharper, colder, pouring all her affection into Michael, as though he alone carried the Walker name forward. Michael, the golden child, the successful son with the corporate job, the polished wife, the shiny SUV. He was celebrated for every minor achievement while my sacrifices were brushed aside as what you're supposed to do. When Michael needed help with a down payment for his house, my mother emptied part of her savings. When Vanessa wanted a new kitchen, my mother praised her vision and chipped in. Yet when I asked for nothing, when I only gave, she twisted my silence into proof that I was invisible, that I did not matter. The bitterness had been growing for years, I realized, and tonight had been its eruption. But she was wrong if she thought I had always taken. I remembered Ethan's third birthday, when I stayed up all night baking a cake from scratch even though I could barely keep my eyes open after a 12-hour shift. I remembered the winters when I patched his coat by hand rather than buy a new one, because every spare dollar went to saving for his education. I remembered driving an old car with a heater that barely worked, so that Ethan could attend summer science camp, the joy on his face when he told me about experiments with dry ice. Those were the moments that defined me, not her cruel words. My mother's voice had called me a leech, but my memories told the truth. I had built a life out of nothing but sweat and willpower. And still, even after all that I had believed in family, I had believed that if I showed up at her birthday with a gift with Ethan by my side, we might bridge the gap between us. Instead, she had turned that belief into a weapon. As I pulled into the parking lot of our small apartment building that night, I looked at Ethan asleep in the back seat, his face still streaked with dried tears. And I knew that I could not let this be the story he carried forward. I would not let him grow up believing that his mother was weak, that she was dependent, that she was what they called her. I thought of my father again, of his faith in me, of the way he had looked at Michael and me with equal love, and I felt something shift in my chest. This was not just about my dignity anymore. It was about proving to my son that we were not parasites. We were survivors, and survivors fight back. The days that followed were thick with unease, as though every breath carried the taste of betrayal, and I could not shake the echo of my mother's voice. I went through my shifts at the hospital in a daze, checking charts and administering medications on autopilot. But behind my professional smile, my mind replayed that night like a broken record. Ethan asked once in the softest whisper if we would ever go back to Grandma's house, and I lied when I said yes, because the truth was, I had no intention of stepping foot there again, unless I had to. But fate, or perhaps something darker, pulled me back sooner than I expected. 2 weeks later, I received a call from my Aunt Margaret, my father's younger sister, who had always kept a wary distance from family drama. Her voice trembled when she said, "Rachel, you should come by the house tomorrow. There's something you need to hear. Don't tell your mother I called." My stomach knotted, fear and curiosity wrestling in my chest, but I agreed. The next afternoon, I drove to the house I had once called home, parking a block away, so my arrival wouldn't be noticed. The windows glowed warmly against the November chill, the smell of roasting meat drifting into the street. But to me, the house looked like a fortress where my name had been erased. I slipped around the side, my breath puffing in the cold air, and crouched near the cracked open window of the dining room. Inside, my mother sat across from Michael at the long oak table, papers spread out before them. Their voices carried easily into the night, every word a dagger. "It's time we made it official," Linda said, her tone brisk, as though she were discussing the weather. "This house should belong to you, Michael. You're the one who deserves it. Rachel has no stability, no real career, no husband. She's just dragging that boy along like dead weight." Michael chuckled, sipping from a glass of red wine. "You don't have to convince me, Mom. The only issue is making sure Rachel doesn't contest it. If she does, it could get messy." My mother leaned closer, lowering her voice, but not enough to escape my straining ears. "That's why we'll have proof. If we can demonstrate that she's emotionally unstable, that she can't manage her own life, no judge will take her side. And if we question her fitness as Ethan's guardian, she'll be too afraid to fight us. She'll back down." My breath caught so violently I nearly gave myself away. They weren't just planning to cut me out of the inheritance, they wanted to attack my very capacity to raise my son. Michael tapped the stack of papers with a satisfied grin. "I already spoke to a lawyer friend. He said if we can get statements from people claiming Rachel's unstable, maybe even a note from a doctor, it'll be enough." Once the house is transferred into my name, we can decide what to do with it. Sell rent doesn't matter. It'll finally be used productively, instead of sitting around for her occasional pity visits. My mother laughed a cruel, brittle sound that twisted my stomach. Exactly. And don't worry if she cries about it, the family will understand. They already see her as a burden. This will just confirm what they know. The words crashed over me like icy water. My knees pressed into the cold dirt, my fingers numb around the phone in my pocket. Every instinct screamed at me to burst in and confront them, to demand how they could plot against their own flesh and blood. But something stronger held me back. For once in my life, I did not rush in with raw emotion. Instead, I carefully slid my phone out, tapped the record button, and let their poison flow into digital permanence. Their voices filled the recording, my mother's confident cruelty, Michael's smug complicity, the unmistakable proof of their scheme. My heart pounded with a mix of rage and triumph. They had underestimated me, dismissed me as weak, but they had just handed me the first weapon I needed. I stayed until they began gathering the papers, my body stiff with cold, then slipped away unnoticed, the recording safe in my hand, like a torch against the dark. Back in my car, I pressed play, listening to their words again, each syllable cutting me, but also stealing me. They were ready to destroy me, to strip me of dignity, to steal the roof over my head, and worst of all, to threaten Ethan's security. But now I had proof. This was no longer just family cruelty, it was a conspiracy, and conspiracies could be dismantled. Driving back to my apartment, the city lights flickering across the windshield, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't felt in weeks: control. For years, I had been silent, swallowing my mother's favoritism toward Michael, her cutting remarks, her cold dismissals. For years, I had convinced myself that keeping the peace was better than fighting battles I couldn't win. But hearing them plot against me, against my son, against the very memory of my father's promise, that snapped something inside me. This wasn't about peace anymore. This was war, and they had just made their first mistake. That night, after I had slipped away from my mother's house with the recording hidden safely in my phone, I lay awake in my apartment staring at the ceiling, Ethan's quiet breathing drifting from the next room. My body trembled not just from the cold I had endured outside that window, but from the storm that raged within me. For hours, I replayed their words, every calculated cruelty, every smug remark, the way my mother spoke of me as though I were a defective piece of furniture to be discarded. Each repetition burned like acid, but instead of consuming me, it hardened something inside. The rage that welled up was unlike any I had known before. It was sharp cold and terrifyingly clear. This wasn't the kind of fury that makes you scream or throw plates. This was the kind that sharpened the senses, the kind that turned grief into steel. For the first time in years, I wasn't just enduring, I was planning. They wanted to paint me as unstable. They wanted to claim I couldn't manage my life or care for Ethan. Very well. Then my every move from this moment forward would be meticulous, deliberate, impossible to twist. I would be the picture of composure while quietly building my case. I sat up in bed, opened a notebook, and began to write. Step 1. Secure the evidence. The recording I had made was damning, but technology could fail. Phones could be lost or stolen. I transferred the file to 2 separate USB drives, one hidden in my closet, the other slipped into my work locker at the hospital. I emailed a copy to myself under an innocuous subject line, then uploaded it to a secure drive with a password only I knew. Step 2. Corroboration. No one would believe just my word against my mother's and Michael's. I needed allies, witnesses, people who could attest to my character and to the reality of the years I had spent supporting my family instead of draining them. I wrote down names: Aunt Margaret, who had already hinted she suspected foul play; Karen, my colleague, who had seen me juggle double shifts while raising Ethan; even Ethan himself. Though I hated the thought of involving him directly, his video of Grandma snapping at him might prove invaluable. Step 3. The legal front. I couldn't fight this battle with emotion alone. I needed a lawyer, someone who specialized in family property disputes, and who had the spine to stand against the manipulations of my mother. The idea of calling a lawyer felt heavy, almost like betraying some sacred rule of family. But then I remembered Megan's smirk, Michael's chuckle, my mother's laughter as they plotted my downfall. And I realized that rule had been shattered long before I decided to defend myself. Step 4, self-preservation. They would try to provoke me to bait me into outbursts they could twist into proof of instability. I vowed not to give them a single slip. Every encounter would be recorded if possible. Every conversation documented, every insult met with silence or dignity. I would not give them ammunition. As the hours ticked by and dawn's first gray light seeped into the room, exhaustion finally pulled me under. But when I woke later that morning, I felt something different coursing through me. For the first time since my mother's birthday party, I was not drowning. I was swimming towards something armed with direction. I looked at Ethan across the breakfast table as he spooned cereal into his mouth, his eyes still shadowed with doubt, and I smiled. "We're going to be okay," I told him softly. "Better than okay." He didn't understand the layers beneath my words, but he smiled back, and that was enough. Later that day, I called Aunt Margaret, my voice calm, deliberate. She agreed to meet me at a cafe across town. When I told her what I had overheard, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I always knew your mother favored Michael, but this is cruelty. George would never have wanted this." When I played her the recording, her face paled. "Rachel, you have to fight them. And I'll stand with you. I'll tell anyone who asks how much you've done for this family, how much you've sacrificed." It was the first affirmation I had received in years, and it steadied me more than she knew. That evening, I confided in Karen during a break at work. She placed a supportive hand on mine. "If they try to call you unstable, I'll testify to every shift you worked, every patient you saved, every time you dragged yourself in despite exhaustion. You're the strongest person I know, Rachel." Her words fed the fire that was now burning steadily, no longer wild, but controlled, focused. When I returned home that night, I sat down with Ethan and explained in terms he could understand. "Grandma and Uncle Michael think they can take away things that belong to us, but I'm not going to let them. I need you to trust me to be brave, and if anyone asks you questions, you just tell the truth. Always the truth." He nodded solemnly, his young face set with a determination that mirrored my own. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "We're fighters, you and me." Alone again in my room, I reviewed my notes, refined my plan, and felt the chill of fear melt into resolve. My rage had transformed into something unrecognizable, something powerful. They thought I would crumble. They thought I would bow my head and retreat, but they had miscalculated. I was not a leech. I was not unstable. I was not weak. I was a mother, a daughter, a woman forged in sacrifice, and I was about to show them just how dangerous it was to underestimate me. The following week, I moved like a woman possessed, but not with the frantic energy of panic. Every step I took was measured, calculated, guided by the plan I had etched into my notebook. At work, I kept my head down, completing my shifts with precision, collecting quiet testimonies of colleagues who respected my resilience. At home, I began assembling a folder thick with proof, each document a piece of armor. I dug through old boxes, pulling out copies of checks I had written to my mother over the years. Receipts from pharmacy runs I had covered, even old birthday cards, in which she thanked me for helping with bills. Individually, they might have seemed trivial, but together they formed a pattern, evidence that I had given, not taken, that I had supported rather than drained. Ethan helped too. One night shyly, he handed me his tablet. "I think you should keep this safe, Mom," he said. When I opened the file, my breath caught. It was a video he had recorded months earlier without my knowledge. A shaky clip of him in the kitchen while my mother snapped at him, calling him a burden just like your mother. Hearing her venom directed at a child made my blood boil, but it also gave me undeniable proof of her cruelty. I hugged Ethan tightly, whispering, "You're brave. This will help us more than you know." With evidence piling up, I turned to the legal front. I researched attorneys until one name came up repeatedly. Thomas Reed, a seasoned lawyer known for handling complex family disputes. I called his office, my voice steady despite the storm in my chest. The secretary scheduled me for a consultation 2 days later. Walking into Reed's office felt like stepping onto a battlefield with a commander at my side. The man himself was in his mid-50s, his hair flecked with gray, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He listened silently as I recounted everything: my mother's outburst, the years of favoritism toward Michael, the overheard conversation, the recording. When I played it for him, his lips pressed into a thin line. "This," he said, "finally is gold. It shows intent, conspiracy, and malice. Combined with your history of financial support and character witnesses, we have a very strong case." I exhaled slowly, relief mixing with adrenaline. What should I do next? He leaned forward. "First, keep documenting. Every interaction, every insult, every suspicious move recorded if you can. Second, secure your allies. Your aunt and your colleague will be invaluable. Third, prepare for them to escalate. If they realize you're not backing down, they may try something desperate. Don't let them corner you alone." His words struck me with both fear and empowerment. I left his office with a formal retainer agreement tucked under my arm, and the sense that I had just armed myself with the weapon my mother never expected me to wield: the law. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of preparation. I met with Aunt Margaret again, recording her statements about the countless times she had seen me hand money to my mother or help around the house. Karen wrote a detailed letter describing my work ethic, the endless nights I had pulled through fatigue to care for patients. I even asked Ethan's teacher, who gladly vouched for my involvement in his schooling, my constant presence at parent-teacher conferences, my advocacy for his education. Piece by piece, the puzzle of my defense grew stronger, and with each addition, I felt the weight of fear shift into something closer to anticipation. Meanwhile, I monitored my mother and Michael from a distance. Word reached me through extended family that they were whispering about my instability, planting seeds of doubt, testing the waters of their narrative. I let them talk, let them believe their lies were spreading, because when the time came, I would rip those lies apart in the harsh light of truth. At night, when Ethan slept, I rehearsed what I would say if confronted. I practiced calm responses to cruel accusations, sculpting my words into blades hidden beneath silk. Sometimes I caught myself trembling with anger, but I forced the tremors into stillness, reminding myself that composure was my shield. One evening, as I reviewed the growing stack of documents, I remembered my father's old lockbox in the attic of our apartment. Inside, beneath faded photographs and his worn Bible, I found the deed to the family home signed by him years earlier. My breath hitched as I read the clause he had included. The property was to be shared equally between his children. Not gifted solely to Michael, not left at Linda's whim, but shared. Tears blurred my vision as I realized my father had known even then the dangers of favoritism, the risks of leaving one child vulnerable. That deed became the crown jewel of my evidence, the undeniable truth that no manipulation could erase. I photocopied it, stored it in multiple places, and tucked the original into Reed's hands the next morning. He studied it with satisfaction. "This," he said, "is the nail in their coffin." As I walked home that day, the November wind biting at my cheeks, I felt taller somehow, straighter. My mother's voice still echoed in my mind, calling me a leech. But now those words no longer sank into my skin like poison. They bounced off, deflected by the armor I had built from sacrifice evidence and sheer willpower. The preparation was nearly complete. The trap they had set for me was about to snap shut on them instead. Thanksgiving arrived heavy with tension, though none of the guests seemed to notice at first. The Walker house glowed with candles, the long dining table dressed in crisp linens and polished silver, the air thick with the smell of turkey and rosemary. Family members gathered with forced smiles, carrying side dishes and bottles of wine, their laughter brittle. I had debated not coming at all, but something deeper than pride pulled me there. This was not just a holiday. It was my battlefield. I walked in carrying not just a pumpkin pie, but a leather folder tucked discreetly under my arm, my evidence, my truth. Ethan held my hand tightly, sensing the storm that lingered beneath the polished surface. My mother sat at the head of the table, regal in her chair, as though she were queen presiding over her court. Michael lounged beside her, Vanessa glowing smugly at his side. When my eyes met hers, she tilted her head with a smile too sharp to be kind. The meal began with all the trappings of tradition. Plates past glasses clinked, the hum of conversation filling the air. But beneath it all, a current of hostility pulsed. My mother avoided my gaze, but I could feel her contempt radiating. Finally, as dessert was served, she struck. "I hope you've enjoyed the meal," she said loudly, her eyes finally locking on me. Some of us at this table actually contribute, unlike others who only ever take. A murmur rippled through the room. Ethan stiffened beside me. I set down my fork with deliberate calm, wiped my lips with a napkin, and rose to my feet. "You're right, Mother," I said evenly. "Tonight is about contribution. And I think it's time everyone here saw exactly what you and Michael have been contributing behind the scenes." Gasps fluttered across the table as I opened the leather folder and spread its contents onto the linen copies of checks, receipts, the deed to the house, the typed statement from Aunt Margaret, the letter from Karen, even the video still of Ethan's recording. The air seemed to freeze as I pressed play on my phone. My mother's voice spilled out cold and clear. "This house should belong to you, Michael. Rachel has no stability, no real career, no husband. She's just dragging that boy along like dead weight." My mother's face drained of color. Michael's eyes widened in shock. Vanessa's smirk faltered. A cousin clapped a hand over her mouth, horrified. I let the recording play on Michael's smug laugh, filling the silence, his words unmistakable. "Once the house is transferred into my name, we can decide what to do with it. Sell rent doesn't matter." My heart pounded, but my voice was steady as I addressed the table. For years, I've been called a burden, a leech, a failure. But here's the truth. I supported this family when you were sick, Mother. I paid bills, bought medicine sacrifice so my son and I could stand tall. And in return, you plotted to strip me of my dignity, my home, and even my right to raise Ethan. Murmurs of outrage rose from the relatives. Vanessa tried to interject, her voice shrill. "This is taken out of context. Everyone conspires in families, it doesn't mean." But before she could finish, Aunt Margaret's voice cut through. "Enough! I've seen Rachel give more to this family than anyone. George would be ashamed of you, Linda." "Ashamed!" My mother sputtered, searching for words, but her face betrayed panic. Michael leaned forward, his confidence crumbling. "Rachel, you don't understand. We were only trying to—" And then the fatal mistake came. Vanessa flustered, hissed at him. "Just admit it. If she'd been declared unstable, we'd have had everything by now." The room erupted in gasps. Her words hung in the air like a confession carved in stone. I felt the weight of triumph settle in my chest, cold and fierce. I turned to the gathered relatives, my voice low but cutting. "You heard it yourselves. This wasn't concern for family. This was a scheme of theft. They underestimated me. They underestimated Ethan. But the truth has a way of coming out." The silence that followed was electric, broken only by the whir of a cousin's phone as he live-streamed the scene to his social media. My mother saw the screen, her face blanching further. "Turn that off!" she barked, but it was too late. Dozens of comments were already appearing, the family's dirty secrets spilling into the community in real time. Michael buried his face in his hands. Vanessa slammed her fist against the table, but her eyes betrayed fear. For the first time, they were the ones cornered, their power stripped bare under the gaze of witnesses and the cold eye of the camera. I gathered my papers, calmly sliding them back into the folder, and sat down with deliberate grace. "This was only the beginning," I said softly but firmly. "The law will hear the rest." The dinner dissolved into chaos, relatives whispering, some openly condemning my mother and Michael, others too stunned to speak. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table, his eyes shining with pride. In that moment, I knew the tide had turned. The days following Thanksgiving unfolded like the slow collapse of a crumbling empire. The recording from that night had already made its way through our extended family. But when my cousin's live stream circulated beyond relatives, neighbors, and church acquaintances began whispering. By Monday morning, the story of Linda Walker and her son Michael scheming against Rachel and Ethan was circulating on Facebook groups across town. At first, I dreaded the exposure, the possibility that people would pity me or worse, doubt me. But the tide of public opinion was swift and merciless, and it did not turn against me. It turned against them. How could a mother do that to her own daughter? One comment read, "Unbelievable cruelty." Another, George Walker would roll in his grave. My mother had always guarded her image as a pillar of respectability, the stern but dignified widow. And now that facade shattered with every new view of the clip. At the same time, Thomas Reed moved quickly. Within 48 hours, he filed a petition with the court to block any attempt at transferring the property, citing the deed that guaranteed equal inheritance between Michael and me. He also submitted the witness statements and Ethan's video as evidence of a broader campaign of psychological abuse. A judge reviewed the emergency filing and granted an injunction. My mother was legally barred from signing the house over to anyone until the case was resolved. For the first time in months, I slept soundly, knowing she could not strip me of what was mine. The consequences for Michael were immediate. Word spread at his firm where reputation was currency, and whispers of conspiracy and elder fraud clung to him like smoke. By the end of the week, his boss called him in. He left the office with his desk belongings in a box and a termination letter in his hand. Vanessa's social media accounts, once a constant stream of curated family photos and humble brag captions, turned silent after people began leaving scathing comments on every post. Friends who once praised her style now accused her of greed, betrayal, cruelty. She tried to clap back, claiming I had manipulated the narrative, but the audio recording left little room for spin. Even strangers who had never met me sided with the voice of a mother calling her child and grandchild dead weight. My mother fared no better. Church friends stopped inviting her to luncheons, neighbors avoided her at the grocery store. I heard through Margaret that she tried to gather sympathy, insisting I had staged the entire ordeal, but no one believed her. The community she had ruled with her sharp tongue and cold glares now turned its back. Meanwhile, Reed escalated the legal battle. He filed a motion to have Michael and Linda investigated for attempted property fraud and elder psychological abuse. The fact that you're her daughter, not her mother, doesn't change the principle, he explained. They tried to fabricate instability. They tried to defraud you of an inheritance. The law views that as serious misconduct. When the hearing date arrived, I walked into the courthouse in a navy suit, Ethan clutching Aunt Margaret's hand in the gallery. My mother sat on the other side, lips pressed in thin. Michael avoiding my gaze. Vanessa glaring daggers. Their lawyer sputtered about family misunderstandings, but the judge was unmoved. The deed from my father was clear. The recording was damning. The testimony from Margaret and Karen painted a vivid picture of my sacrifices, my stability, my worth. The judge's words rang through the courtroom. This court finds that any attempt to transfer this property without Rachel Walker's consent is unlawful. Furthermore, this court admonishes Linda Walker and Michael Walker for conduct unbecoming of family bordering on fraud. Custody of the minor child, Ethan Walker, is in no way compromised. This case is closed. Relief washed over me like a wave. My mother's face crumpled. Michael slumped. Vanessa hissed under her breath. But the gavel had spoken. Legally, I was safe. Socially, their punishment deepened. Michael's unemployment stretched into months, his once flawless reputation shredded. Vanessa's friends drifted away, unwilling to be associated with scandal. My mother's isolation grew. Invitations stopped, phone calls dwindled. She had built her power on respect and fear, and both had evaporated. But the punishment was not only external, it was internal too. For the first time, I saw fear in their eyes. Not fear of me, but fear of consequences. They had assumed I would stay silent, ashamed. They had gambled on my obedience, my desire for family peace. Instead, I had fought back with evidence, with law, with the truth. And the cost to them was everything they valued: reputation, career, comfort, power. After the hearing, Ethan hugged me tightly in the courthouse hallway. "You did it, Mom," he whispered. "You showed them we're not leeches." Tears filled my eyes, but they were tears of release, not pain. "No, sweetheart," I whispered back. "We showed them. You and me, together." That night, as I tucked him into bed, I realized the punishment for my mother and brother went beyond legal rulings or social disgrace. The real punishment was the exposure of their cruelty, the stripping away of the masks they had worn for so long. They had lost the ability to control the narrative, to cast me as the weak one, the dependent one. Now the world saw them for what they were: schemers, abusers, betrayers. And that was a sentence no judge could overturn. The weeks after the court ruling felt like breathing fresh air after years of suffocation. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I no longer lived under the weight of my mother's shadow, or the sting of Michael's superiority. The chains of silence and humiliation had been broken. I came home to our modest apartment one evening, Ethan already working on his homework at the kitchen table, and realized I didn't feel ashamed anymore. I felt free. The next morning, with Reed's guidance, I arranged for new locks and cameras to be installed at the family house. It was still half mine, and now I intended to protect it. Walking through the halls I had once tiptoed in, terrified of my mother's disdain, I now moved with purpose. Every room smelled faintly of dust and old grief. But I opened the windows, let the air flow, and imagined a future where Ethan and I might spend weekends there without fear. I called a cleaning service, and when the team arrived, I watched them haul out years of clutter, the artifacts of my mother's control. With every bag that left the house, I felt lighter. Ethan ran through the garden laughing, chasing leaves as they swirled in the autumn wind. His joy filled the space in a way it hadn't been filled in decades. "Mom," he shouted breathlessly, "this feels like ours now." And he was right. For the first time it did. Aunt Margaret visited often, helping me organize the documents, ensuring everything was filed securely. Her presence reminded me that family could mean support instead of betrayal. One evening she said George would be proud of you. He always knew you were the strong one. I held her hand, tears pricking my eyes. "I just wish he had been here to see it," I whispered. She smiled sadly. "In a way he was. Every step you took had his spirit in it." At work, colleagues who had quietly supported me now looked at me with new respect. Karen told me, "You've shown all of us what resilience looks like. You didn't just survive, you fought." Even patients' families who had caught wind of the story offered words of encouragement. It was strange after years of being dismissed to feel seen. Yet the most important change was at home. Ethan walked taller, his grades improved, his laughter came easier. One night as I tucked him in, he whispered, "I'm proud of you, Mom." Those words carried more weight than any court ruling. Still, freedom came with boundaries. I made it clear to my mother that I would no longer play the dutiful daughter. I answered her occasional phone calls with cool politeness, but never indulgence. When she tried once to invite herself over, I simply said, "The house is not open to you right now." The stunned silence on the other end was proof enough that the power dynamic had shifted. Michael never called at all. Vanessa sent one bitter text, "You ruined us," which I deleted without reply. Their silence was its own confession. Their absence, the truest punishment. Months later, when word reached me that Michael had taken a job far beneath his former rank, I felt no gloating, only a detached sense of justice. Actions had consequences, and he was living them. Ethan and I moved forward. We spent weekends at the house, filling it with our laughter, our projects, our life. I painted the kitchen a warm yellow, planted flowers in the garden, even framed my father's deed, and hung it in the hallway as a reminder that this place was built on fairness, not greed. Every nail hammered, every brushstroke applied, felt like reclaiming not just walls, but dignity. In quiet moments, I sat on the same porch where my father once told me the house would always be mine, and I whispered into the night I kept it, Dad. I kept us safe. The stars above seemed to shimmer in approval. By spring, the fear had faded into memory. Ethan brought friends over, their laughter echoing through the halls, proof that the house was no longer a battlefield, but a sanctuary. On one of those evenings, as I watched him play in the yard, I realized the greatest victory was not just keeping what was ours, but showing him what resilience looks like. He would grow up knowing his mother had fought not just for property, but for respect for truth, for the right to stand tall. And I knew that when he faced his own battles someday, he would remember this. My story was no longer one of shame. It was one of defiance, of justice, of a woman underestimated but never broken. My mother's words still echoed sometimes, You and your kid are just leeches, but they no longer cut. They were proof of her blindness, her cruelty. They reminded me of how far I had come and how wrong she had been. Because we were not leeches. We were builders, survivors, fighters, and we had won. Months after the storm had passed, when the dust of court battles, whispered gossip, and shattered family ties finally settled, I found myself sitting alone on the porch of the house my father had promised would always be mine. The spring air carried the scent of lilacs, the garden blooming in colors my mother would never see again. And for the first time in years, I felt peace. Ethan was inside working on a school project, his laughter drifting through the open window, like music proof that life had not only survived, but flourished. In those quiet moments, I thought back to the night my mother had screamed in my face, calling me and my son leeches. I remembered the humiliation, the silence of relatives who did nothing, the sting of being dismissed as worthless. I remembered how small I had felt, how powerless. And then I remembered the steps that followed the cold rage, the careful planning, the gathering of evidence, the confrontation at Thanksgiving that shattered the masks my family had worn for so long. What began as an attempt to crush me had transformed into the very catalyst that freed me. The moral was sharp, undeniable, and etched into every choice I made. Afterward, family is not defined by blood, but by loyalty, respect, and love. My mother had broken the bond of trust the moment she saw me not as her daughter, but as a rival to be destroyed. Michael had forfeited brotherhood when he chose greed over truth. Their punishment was not just in losing the house or their reputations. It was in losing me, losing the relationship that could have sustained them in their old age. Betrayal has a price, and they paid it in isolation. Ethan asked me one evening, "Do you think Grandma will ever say sorry?" I looked into his wide, hopeful eyes and felt the ache of wanting to give him an answer he could cling to. But honesty mattered more than comfort. "Maybe she will," I said carefully. "But even if she doesn't, that doesn't change who we are. We don't need her apology to live with dignity." That was the lesson I wanted etched into his heart. Our worth is not defined by what others call us, but by what we choose to be. My mother had called us leeches, but we had proven ourselves builders of a future. Michael had treated me as an obstacle, but I had stood firm and shown him that obstacles can become walls no greed can climb. Vanessa had sneered at me, but she had learned that sneers crumble when truth is revealed. Even in their silence now, they served as reminders of what happens when betrayal takes root. Their absence was not a wound, it was a boundary. And boundaries are a form of love too. Love for oneself, love for one's child, love for the dignity that no one can steal. Looking back, I realized how easy it would have been to walk away that night at the birthday party, to accept their words to shrink. How easy it would have been to internalize the lie and live in the shadow of shame. Many women in my position might have, but I had chosen differently, and that choice had changed everything. The courtroom victory was important, yes. The injunction, the judge's words, the legal recognition of my right, all of it mattered. But what mattered more was the personal victory, the reclaiming of my voice, my identity, my strength. Justice had not only been served in the eyes of the law, it had been served in the eyes of my son, in the eyes of my aunt, in the eyes of the community that now saw me not as a victim, but as a fighter. And if there was one thing I wanted anyone listening to my story to take away, it was this: never underestimate the quiet resilience of someone who has sacrificed, someone who has endured, someone who has been dismissed. The very traits others call weakness are often the ones that become the sharpest weapons. My mother underestimated me. Michael underestimated me. They thought silence meant surrender. Instead, silence became strategy, and strategy became victory. Ethan came out onto the porch, then holding his project in his hands, a diorama of a house complete with a tiny paper garden and a porch with stick figures standing proud. "It's us, Mom," he said shyly. "Our home." I took it from him carefully, tears stinging my eyes. "It's perfect," I whispered, and I meant it in ways he couldn't yet understand. That diorama wasn't just cardboard and glue. It was a symbol of the life we had rebuilt, the justice we had secured, the future we had claimed. And in that moment, I knew the story was no longer about betrayal. It was about triumph. It was about proving that dignity can outlast cruelty, that love can outshine greed, that truth can defeat lies. If I could speak to every person who had ever been underestimated, every daughter dismissed, every single mother sneered at, I would tell them this: do not bow your head. Gather your evidence. Stand your ground. Protect your children. Because justice is not just a dream. It is a fight, and it is a fight worth winning. My mother once screamed that I was nothing but a leech, but in the end, it was her greed that drained her life, her cruelty that bled her respect, her betrayal that stripped her legacy. And me, I stood taller. I lived freer. I turned her words into my weapon, and I won.